Um, so for everyone here, thank you for coming to our very first lecture in the Tripod lecture series. And Rhianne, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
For those who don't know, Tripod is a creative co-working space in Brixton, and we're very lucky to be surrounded by a super innovative, creative and successful, and a load of very successful companies working in design and tech. And so here to talk to you all today is the lovely Rhianne from Extant. Extant is the UK's leading professional performing arts company of visually impaired artists and theatre practitioners, producing touring productions, delivering training, and articulating and celebrating what visual impairment brings to the performing arts. So just to let everyone know, I think we're going to record this conversation, if that's okay with everyone. And then it can be uploaded to the Tripod website, and then anyone that didn't manage to make it here this evening can re-watch it. So Charlotte, I think if you can record it, that would be amazing. If you have any questions for Rhianne, or if you have anecdotes or experiences you want to share or anything like that, maybe just write them in the chat and then I can read them all out and we can pick them up later at the end, if that's okay with you, Rhianne.
Yeah.
Cool. So without further ado, thank you for making the time to be here and share your experience. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Alex. So yeah, as Alex said, my name is Rhianne. I'm General Manager of Extant. And we are the UK's leading professional performing arts company who explore visual impairment to create unique and innovative artistic experiences. And we place visually impaired people at the centre of everything that we do. And as Alex sort of touched on, that's things from like the productions that we create to the artists that we employ or support to build stronger careers in the arts sector, and the audiences we perform to and the participants that we work with as well. So since our inception in 1997, our strength has been to our drive to innovate and create exciting shared experiences for visually impaired and sighted audiences. And we always aim to uncover new collaborations, forms and practices. So at the moment, our work falls into four main, but sort of interlinked programs, which are professional artistic productions, artist developments, audiences and access, and participation programs as well. So in terms of our productions, over the last 20 years, we've presented in a whole host of formats, from productions in conventional theatre venues, pioneering immersive performances in the dark that featured robotic guiding navigation, and outdoor productions as well. So just to give you a little bit of context in the world that we work in, really, we use the social model of disability, and that is based on the principle that disability is caused by the way that society is organised, rather than by someone's impairment or their difference. And it puts an emphasis on what needs to be done to identify and remove barriers for those people. The Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, their data shows that the level of engagement in the arts is so much lower among disabled people than non-disabled people. And a report from the Royal National Institute of Blind People shows that half of visually impaired people in particular feel that their choice of leisure activities is limited. So kind of thinking about this context, inclusivity is central to the design of our work and everything that we do. So I'm going to talk about how Extant has designed work around accessibility for visually impaired audiences specifically, the way in which this has been affected by the pandemic, and what we would like to see in the future. So I'll start with the past. It seems like a logical place to begin. So the most common form of inclusive design for visually impaired audiences, specifically in theatre, is what we would call traditional audio description. And it's been available in sort of a growing number of theatres in the UK since the late 1980s. And it essentially is a live verbal commentary providing information on the visual elements of a production as it unfolds. So it really describes the action that is essential to the understanding of the play's story, as well as other visual information such as the style or design of a production, set and costumes, facial expressions and visual jokes that blind or visually impaired audience members might otherwise miss. And it's delivered, the audience member will wear a headset and it's delivered in between the dialogue of the performance, so in between the characters speaking, live, in the performance, and it's usually written by a specialist audio describer once the play and once all the rehearsals are complete. So it's sort of tagged on to the end. Over the last 20 years that we've been working, we've sort of been discussing some of the problems with this method. So traditional AD is what we would describe as closed. So unless you were sort of directly using the service, it's likely that you'd be really unaware that anything different was happening for the audience. And sort of because of that, it's really remained an invisible form of inclusive design as such. So I think it's fair to say that things like BSL are really highly visible, and it offers something new to the audience as well, whether you're using that access feature or not. And that sort of creates a sense of isolation and social stigma within that sort of design there. And also things like technical difficulties are a really common problem. So things like poor sound quality and discomfort from wearing the headset. Typically, and in its most common form, AD in the traditional sense adopts quite a neutral stance in terms of content and delivery. And that's sort of in an attempt to avoid subjectivity. And it aims really to reflect the point of view of the audience rather than that of the artistic team who have designed the production. And so we often see that questions are raised by visually impaired people about the purpose of the access and whether it should provide users with access to the story or a more immersive experience that's comparable to the rest of what the rest of the audience are experiencing. And sort of the third and final snag that we see is that it can be incredibly costly to deliver. There's a lot of tech involved, and it therefore is sort of generally only delivered live at 1 or 2 performances in a run in a conventional theatre space. And just sort of to put that into context, we see in the UK in 2019 that 20% of theatres offered audio description on only 45% of their production. So it's an incredibly slim figure. So in all of Extant's work, we've tried to combat some of these problems by coming up with different ways of designing audio description for blind and visually impaired audiences, but also to create a shared experience for sighted audience and non-disabled audiences as well. And we do that through something called integrated access. And that is access features, specifically in this case, audio description, that it's not bolted on at the end in the way that traditional AD is. And it's built into the very fabric of the work from the outset, and it sort of becomes part of the aesthetic of the piece. And one of the pros of doing this is that it makes access provisions something that audiences expect to see in the design of theatre. And it's sort of, we know that it's so much easier to think about something from the beginning that fits aesthetically together with the rest of your piece, rather than fitting something on at the end simply to provide access and just as an access provision, and it serves no other purpose. So there's some really promising research in museums that has shown that an open multi-sensory description design can enhance the whole audience experience, and it makes a visit more memorable for everyone, and not just people who have specific needs. And so we think that it's possible that this sort of open multi-sensory access provisions in live performance can achieve the same thing. So I'm going to talk about a bit of an example so that you can sort of get a sense of what we mean when we say integrated access. So in 2014, Extant created a production called The Chairs. It was written by Eugene Ionesco in the 1950s, and it's quite often described as a tragic farce. And the play involves 2 elderly characters who exist in this unidentified location that sort of we believe to be post-apocalyptic. And throughout the play, they welcome a host of invisible characters. So Extant cast the play with 2 blind actors, and we created within the very sound design the inner voices of the elderly couple, and they voiced the visuals around them. And not only did that provide access for our VI audiences, but it also allowed us to draw on their feelings of loneliness and entrapment that they're experiencing as characters. So I'm going to share my screen and show you a little clip of what that is. So give me 1 second just to do that. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. Let me share my sound as well. Okay, I'll make it full screen. Okay.
Out from doors, back to chairs. Out from doors, back to chairs. He's in my way. He's in my way.
The play is an absurdist tragic farce about an old man and an old woman, both in their 90s, who are preparing frantically lots and lots of chairs throughout the course of the play for a series of invisible guests.
Well, I hope you've invited everyone, all the big names, all the property developers and experts.
Oh yes, all the property developers and experts.
Chemists, violinists, troublemakers, boilermakers, scaffolding directors, associate directors, television, politicians, spin doctors and helicopters.
Yes, miners, artists, designers, everyone with a little expertise and an interest in property.
Bankers.
Well, obviously.
Post-Marxists, neo-Nazis, fundamentalists, environmentalists, therapists and therapy.
Well, yes, of course, since they all amount to property developers and experts.
Holding the door open, following them in.
It's all rather Spartan, I'm afraid. And how was the weather?
Tiring journey, you must be exhausted.
What, on the beach?
Oh, you really are too kind.
Let me get you a chair.
The guests have come to hear the orator deliver the old man's speech.
Evening. Thank you. This is my wife.
Shaking hands above my head.
Evening. Oh, thank you. This is my wife. Evening. Thank you. This is my wife.
Who are all these people, Poppet?
The orator is coming.
Oh, he's coming.
He's coming.
He's coming.
He's coming.
He's coming.
He's coming. He's coming.
He's coming. He's coming.
He's coming.
He comes.
He comes.
He comes. He's here.
He comes. He's here.
He comes. He's here. He's here.
He's here.
Turning to face the central panel at the back.
He's here.
Turning to face the other door.
Registering portal contact. Registering commencement of entry.
The figure.
It's implied that this speech is of life and world-changing significance.
Registering reactivation. Engaging to communicate.
You might have been a master craftsman. Or a master of disguise. Or a chess grand master of the hunt.
The play cleverly incorporates audio description into the live performance, with the actors giving pertinent visual descriptions within the dialogue.
Where was I?
The two of us came.
Using the mob to help me stand, to help me stand.
The two of us came.
The two of us
Katie
came.
Pie.
The two of us came.
Two of us came. Two of us came.
The two of us came to a great metal gate.
Oh, I'm right beside you, Poppy.
It's not the same!
Grab the mop, hug it, face the wall. Scanning. Searching. Losing connection.
I'm gonna stop it there. So I hope that gives you a really good idea of how the audio description was integrated within like, the actual sound design of the production, and how the characters voice their own actions through this inner monologue that everybody in the audience hears, so it creates a shared experience. In producing work in this way, we found that every production is different in terms of how you would integrate the access. Sometimes it's really like how the access will be integrated stands out at the very beginning of the process, and sometimes it needs to be worked out through a process of research and development and actually in the rehearsal room. But we found that the biggest and most important thing is having blind and partially sighted people in the room with us to develop and test any of our ideas with, so that we are sure that it's going to work in the way that we intend. So from our audience evaluations, we see about 90% good or excellent feedback for what we're doing, or what we have done in the past. But as time's gone on, we've really wanted to explore what visually impaired people's responses were to similar types of work that were being created by disabled and non-disabled led theatre companies. So in our 20th anniversary year, we commissioned a research inquiry into the use of audio description and integrated access in the UK. And it brought together feedback from visually impaired audiences and also creative teams who were charged with creating these type of integrated access provisions. One thing became really, really clear to us, and that is that this work lacks exposure. Companies working with these techniques do it in isolation, and that means that reputable resources on the topic and resources on how to create work like this is really difficult to find. And we started with two questions. So we asked ourselves, do we truly understand what visually impaired people need from access? And do the current models of access meet those needs? I won't go into too much detail about the report, it's quite long, but in a nutshell, they found that there's a general worry about complacency among visually impaired audiences. For some companies and venues, including traditional audio description is enough for their audiences. And some of the issues with integrating access in this type of design is that without sufficient critical thought as to how it's going to function technically or creatively, and at its worst, integrating the access artistically can override its purpose to actually access what is really there and what's happening. And it can be tricky not to obscure it through too much creativity. But at its best, we found that this type of access can become part of the creative process from the very beginning. And it actually offers artists another tool in their toolkit and the opportunity to interrogate their art, and also offering them another way of providing immersive experiences for its users and for its audiences. So that's sort of where we got up to before the pandemic struck. And obviously, like a lot of sectors, the art sector has found the past 12 months incredibly difficult. And there has been, a lot of organisations that have really struggled to survive. And in order to survive, lots of organisations picked up their productions that they had already, shown to audiences. They literally picked them up and they put them online. So we saw, in sort of a rush to produce content for audiences to access at home, we saw a lot of people using archival footage of productions, and they were just placed online on a format, and without any adjustments. So that slim figure that we talked about before of productions that actually have audio description in them remained because people didn't take or couldn't take the opportunity to include audio description or other accessible design features into their productions at that point. And Another thing that happened was, we know that visually impaired people face barriers to travelling to venues and physical access once they're in a venue. So I think a lot of people initially assumed that, brilliant, we're going to take these productions to people in their homes and they're automatically going to be more accessible because people don't have to travel anywhere. But there was a whole host of new platforms and technology that people were using, and there wasn't one specific platform that was consistent across the sector that everybody was familiar with, or that had been tested using a systems technology like screen readers and magnification software. So they hadn't tested the accessibility of the host site that they were using. So we spent quite a lot of time battling one of our biggest challenges in the last 12 months, which is getting our audience online. So we picked a conferencing platform. We picked Zoom. We tested it for its accessibility and how it would work with accessibility software. And we essentially gave people one-to-one sessions on how to use the platform, and so that they could access things that we were putting on, or potentially other companies were putting on Zoom as well. We also spent quite a lot of time thinking about content that we can create for our audience that is beyond just putting our archival footage, which we know is accessible, but just beyond putting our archival footage online. So we've been playing around with some subverting conferencing platforms and their uses, like Zoom, to create live performances that we know our audiences can access. One of those performances was Band, and that was a presentation of a podcast that was actually recorded before lockdown, but we represented it in a way where a visually impaired actor posed provocations to our audience who were experiencing the podcast for the first time, and they could leave their responses and their thoughts in the chat, or respond orally and with their audio to the provocations directly, and also leave comments on social media. So we started experimenting with all these different ways to show accessible work online, but also have our audiences engage with us and engage with each other, because we knew that that was going to be something that was really important as we all sort of adapted to these new restrictions and the new way that isolation is changed our lives for the last 12 months. So thinking about the future, I wanted to highlight a couple of things that Extant are working towards and things that we want to see from the sector in the future to keep 30 years of really slow progress moving forward and not regress into the situation that we were in the past. So we're predicting that particularly disabled audiences are likely to be slower and less confident going back into the theatre than other audiences. And so we think it's really important that we provide content for this portion of the audience, and also people who don't want to travel, people who might still be shielding, by designing products that aren't just live in a space, and they also have an accessible digital reach, and can be accessed from home. The other thing that we want to see is that the pandemic has revealed a lot of stark inequalities within our sector. And as the sector is rebuilding, we're seeing it as an opportunity to create this new equilibrium and really evaluate and redesign what do we want our sector to be. And it's an opportunity for us and other companies like us to keep accessible design at the forefront of the debate about what the sector will look like and what sort of design are we producing, what work are we putting out there for people to see. So one of the ways we're doing that is we are delivering training for small touring theatre companies who we see really often can't afford the costly traditional audio description that I mentioned before. And it comes in the form of a programme we're running called Enhance. And the programme's intended to offer an alternative to traditional audio description in a similar way that I've talked about how we have done over the past 20 years, but also a lo-fi way that supports access for blind and partially sighted audiences in the work of other companies. So we've a couple of options to support the needs of the eye audiences, and they sort of range from the point of creation in the way that we work, the access becoming part of the very aesthetic of the piece and part of the fabric of the piece, but also some options for post-production where we recognise people might have started without thinking about this from the very beginning, and so we wanted to leave in options for companies that learn about this at a later stage. And so they include things like advising on what we call integrated access dramaturgy, and that's finding ways, again, to integrate the access features into the design of the piece. Developing touch tours, which is an opportunity for visually impaired audiences to get up on stage, feel the props, feel the costume, feel the set, and have it described to them, and experience what is going to happen in the production in an alternative way beforehand, so they know certain things about the production and the design before you even start. And live program notes, which do something similar to audio description in that they explain the visual cues, but they explain in advance, you know, the visual cues, so that visually impaired audiences know from the beginning when Sarah says this, she's doing this action, and they can then sort of visualize that. We also cover accessible marketing material and how you should market to visually impaired audiences, and also advice on how to develop relevant audiences so that we know this work, all this hard work that people are putting into making their work accessible, is being accessed by visually impaired people, and so that visually impaired people can really access the culture that the UK has to offer. And so we work in this way because we think that it offers companies a tool in their toolkit, similar to artists. It offers people a tool in their toolkit to do this once with the help of Extant, and then think about this in all of their future work and be able to include accessibility features in their work from the very beginning of their design, so that it fits aesthetically with their piece and isn't a tag on at the end, and also provides audiences, visually impaired audiences, with the access that they need to experience this culture. I'm really conscious of time, so I'm going to leave it there. So I hope that was useful and interesting, and I think I'm going to hand back over to Alex to take some questions. Are you there, Alex, or shall I just read questions from the chat?
Hello, sorry, I'm back. Thank you so much, Rhianne. That was so interesting. I feel like you answered so many questions that I had constantly had in my head, like, actually, how does it work? And you made it make so much sense, so thank you for that. I'm just going to read out a few of the questions in the chat, if that's okay. Stephen's been writing so many questions. I want you could turn on your microphone so you could ask them yourself, but I'm not sure we can do that in this mode. I'll try and do them justice. So first question, can you incorporate people who are hard of hearing into the same performances, or is that an entirely different situation?
So I'm purely speaking from a perspective of visually impaired audiences, because that's who Extant deal with. But our Is It Working report also looked at integrated access as a whole. So that includes things like integrated BSL, integrated captioning, and those sorts of things as well. But I just talk about it from a visually impaired perspective. So it's all possible, and all the same principles can be applied. Obviously, you know, you're looking at different issues because it's not specifically related to audio description, but it definitely can be done. And I've seen productions that are done very well in terms of integrating captioning, BSL, and audio description all at the same time. So it definitely can all be done.
Okay, amazing. And I had a question for you with regards to the set design. Does it change depending on the performances that you're giving, in the sense that, like, would does it become more elaborate, less elaborate, more easy to navigate for people who are visually impaired, etc.?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. Like we obviously work with visually impaired actors. So any time that we're working with visually impaired actors, the set is designed with built-in ways for them to navigate the stage. And that can be done through things like I don't know if you know about the corduroy or the bobbled paving when you come to a road or at a zebra crossing. So we can use similar techniques that visually impaired performers can feel underfoot, so they know where they are and what part of the stage they're on. And in terms of describing it to the audience, like you probably saw from the video of the chairs, the set was quite elaborate, but it was designed that way and it stayed that way for all the performances. And we're very much always thinking about how can we make this thing accessible, not what can we design that will be easy to describe. I hope that makes sense.
That makes complete sense. And then also, I guess within that, it means that it's completely accessible and it's not just, even though it is made for a specific group of people in mind, it's also accessible to everyone.
Yeah. I don't have time to talk about it now. I am denied about putting it in, but there's a concept called universal design. And if you don't know about it, you should look it up. It's about designing things for everyone's enjoyment and for shared experiences, not just about designing something for a specific group of people. And so we don't talk about that too often, but it's something that's sort of inherent in all of our work.
I will look it up. It sounds super interesting. Okay, so also from Stephen has said, do you find it difficult to cater to both blind and partially sighted? Or I think we already answered that question, so I might just skip that one for time. And then another one, do you have members of the respective communities involved in the design process throughout?
Yes, in short, yes. It's the most important thing that we have people with lived experience involved in what we do. So Maria Ashodi, our artistic director, is blind. The majority of the actors that we work with are blind. And, we have in the past worked with blind backstage crew. And so there's always people involved in the process, and we try and create as many employment opportunities we can for blind and visually impaired people. And that's a whole nother topic about employment. Yeah, we always involve people. It's really important to have someone there who is a dedicated space to put those access questions to. One of the things that we see quite often is, take, for example, you're a visually impaired writer of a play that's being produced in a venue. We quite often see the roles being merged, and that writer then is expected to become the access consultant for the entire venue and know about toilets. And obviously the writer's involved somewhat in the design, but know about toilets and paving and stairs and all those sort of things. But it's really important that those two roles don't get merged and that you have someone there dedicated to those things, because just because you're a visually impaired writer doesn't mean you're an expert in all things access. And it's a responsibility that needs a dedicated space.
Yeah, I think that's so true. So another couple of questions. How do you advertise in a way that reaches a diverse audience?
Good question. So I have a couple of tips. The first tip is we work a lot, specifically within Extant, we work a lot within sight loss organisations that already exist. So we making sure we're networking in the right places. And quite often that can be like going to their regular coffee mornings when we're allowed to go face to face and speaking about our work. We use social media quite a lot. It's something that we've had to do more so in the past 12 months. But I think my biggest tip in terms of reaching a diverse audience is be clear and concise about what access provisions you have in place, and not prescribing what sort of who it's suitable for. So it's about saying we have audio description, we have BSL, we have captioning, are just the three that spring to mind, and letting people decide for themselves if that's something that's accessible to them. We have breakout rooms and things like that, just being really clear about what's already in place and being open to taking responses as well, and taking questions about, could you have this or do you have that? And there's loads of resources out there in terms of organizations like Talking Newspapers. We have quite a big database of people that have followed our work for a long time, which I know isn't particularly helpful if you're advertising to new audiences, but we rely on that quite a lot. And word of mouth. I think if you have a track record for producing something that's accessible and you can get endorsement from companies that people trust, that your work is accessible, is almost a guarantee that your work is going to be suitable for diverse audiences.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And from Simon, oh, hey Simon, that's nice to see you. Simon's asked, I once saw Going Dark at the Young Vic. You create an inclusive experience which successfully embeds cues about visual happenings into the holistic experience. Do you have a twisty experience to give sighted audience a perspective of living without reliance on sight? So a sound-centric scene.
That's a really good question, and I'm really pleased that that was brought up actually. So I think it was in 2015, before my time at the company, we produced a piece called Flatland, and all of the audience were totally plunged into darkness. And so it didn't matter who you were, what your needs were, you were totally plunged into darkness. And we monitored everybody through like night vision CCTV, but we created a system, and it was like a handheld device, and it was like a little haptic robot that if it twisted to the left, you should turn left, or if it vibrated once, you should reach up. And so we had all sort of things, scenes around the audience in the dark, and there were like small interactive experiences for them to sort of engage with as they were going through this narrative and being guided by this haptic device. And the feedback was so interesting from audiences, is just working in a way that sensory way that was different to how they would normally think. And there are quite a few companies that are starting to play around with theatre in the dark, particularly at the moment. So there's Glenn Neath, who writes pieces that are set in mostly in shipping containers, and they're totally in the dark. And you have a headset on, and they use binaural sound to try and emulate people moving around your head or coming close to you, and that sort of thing. So really accessible for visually impaired audiences, of course, but really interesting from the perspective of a sighted audience to rely on other senses to get the narrative and to think in a different way.
And I guess at that point, you're also not necessarily making it to be specifically for that audience, but rather to be for everyone. And then it means that everyone's welcome. And also, I guess it really amazingly challenges the idea that, like, disability is only it's only there because everything is not accessible. Like if more things were accessible, then it wouldn't be so prevalent, I guess.
And so that's why it's really important that, like, we work from the social model of disability, and it's not about you can't do this because you have this medical condition. It's you can't do this because that's not made accessible to you. And I think for me, when I first started working at Extant, that was a huge shift in my thinking. You sort of see the world in one particular way, and then it's just like it can take a lot of work to think differently like that, but it's so enriching when you do think like that. And actually, as someone who's non-disabled, I also get access to so many more things by thinking that way. And it's about creating shared experience between disabled and non-disabled people as well.
So interesting. I think so. There's just one or two more things here, and then I think just to be conscious of time, if maybe we'll see if there's any more questions, but otherwise. So Simon's also asked, are there examples of learning how to create a richer theatre experience in general, which others might not have thought of without employing VI writers or actors or listening to a VI audience? So as per universal design, the benefits comes back round to all.
I think for us as a company, one huge thing that we advocate for is to always consult with the people that are going to access your production or are going to use these access features. We obviously advocate for that to be a paid opportunity because it is a job. And I think it's one of the most important things because, as I say, like for me, before I started with Extant, it can be a big shift in your thinking and you're not always going to get it right. And if you get it wrong, it can actually be worse than not including it at all. And so I think consulting, and even if you're not employing a visually impaired person as the writer for that piece, I think employing somebody as an access consultant or engaging with a company like Extant to talk about how to create those richer theatre experiences is really, really important and is just like a total must for us.
I actually think I might have phrased that incorrectly. I think you answered really well, but I think maybe what Simon was trying to, or what I actually just misread, was that are there things that you've learned from working with visually impaired people that can then be applied to other theatre performances to enrich them that they wouldn't have got?
Well, okay, that makes sense. That's a good question. I'm sure there is, but none come to mind right now. It is not helpful, I know.
Simon, maybe we'll have to go to one of the performances and then we can find out.
Yeah, I think even so, obviously you don't want to take access features away from somebody who might need them if there's a limited amount of, if they are delivering it through a headset or something like that. But I think going to performances that include access features, particularly performances that have it integrated, and I can send Alex some links there's a really good example of a company that we've worked with called She Goat, who totally integrated the access into their production, and it just changed didn't change the aesthetic of their piece, but it just added this such a rich layer. That going to performances that try and do that is really a good way to challenge your thinking about what you're including in your theatre performances, and the best way is to just absorb it and then go and apply it to your own work, because obviously for everybody we all work in different ways and we're all producing different types of theatre. Like theatre is such a broad part of the arts that it can be really different from one production to another, how you might make that richer experience.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Rhianne. This has been so interesting. I'm going to just kind of draw this to a close by asking you, A, what people can expect in the next year, and B, where can everyone find you?
Good questions. So in the next year, we're currently in a stage of fundraising for some really big, exciting projects. We're hoping to, I'm going to say this publicly, and it's going to be like trying to will it to happen, because if I say it publicly, it has to happen, right? That's how the world works. So we're aiming to introduce 2 new members of staff to our team. So we're aiming to employ a visually impaired person to roll out this work in integrated access and enhance. And we're also hoping to employ somebody to do our artist development side of things, so helping more artists have better, more sustainable careers in the arts. And we also have an exciting secret project that we're hoping we will get some funding for, to do some more creation and some more actual artwork, which will be really great after the year that we've had. You can find us at www.extant.org.uk, And we're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook as Extant Ltd.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here and for listening. I think these conversations are really important, and it's such a pleasure to have an insight into all the amazing work that you do. So thank you so much. If I may be so bold, I'm just going to plug us for a second. Our next Tripod lecture is going to be on the 14th of April at the same time, so 6 p.m. And it's going to be given by Tommaso from Buono Prismontas, who are a spatial and architectural design duo. And they're also locally based in Brixton, and are kind of friends of the company. So I'll leave a link to that in the chat for anyone who's interested. Or actually, I don't have a link to that. I'll send it to everyone for anyone who's interested. But I think that just about draws us to a conclusion. So thank you everyone for your time. Thank you so much, Rhianne.
Thanks for having me.
I hope I can see you again soon. I hope we end up back in the office at some point soon. But everyone, thank you so much for coming. Hope to see you all at the next one. So thank you.